The chandeliers were ablaze with 1,000 trembling lights, yet the ballroom of Hawthorne House felt dimmer than it ought, as though brilliance itself had grown ashamed of what it was about to witness. Silk skirts whispered secrets across the marble floor, fans fluttered like nervous birds, and every smile was sharpened into something observant, measuring, and cruel. In such rooms, happiness was never free. It was bartered, weighed, and granted only to those deemed worthy. On this night, worthiness was being quietly debated, and one young woman stood at its center, unarmed, as Eleanor Ashcombe lingered near a pillar, half veiled by trailing ivy, her posture composed, her hands folded with practiced restraint. Her gown was dove-gray, modest in cut, unfashionably sincere, and sewn with a care that spoke of mended hymns rather than Parisian indulgence. She had chosen it not to be admired, but to endure. Her face bore that particular calm learned by women who have been observed too often and rescued too rarely. If she felt the weight of eyes upon her, she gave no sign, though each whisper struck her like a pin. They spoke of her father's fall, of debts, and a name once respectable, now recited with indulgent pity. They spoke of her mother, who had dared to labor with her own hands, as though survival were an indecency. They spoke, most of all, of what Eleanor was not wealthy, not protected, not safely forgettable. In a society that forgave sin more readily than poverty, she was an inconvenience, dressed as a lady. Still, she remained, breathing evenly, refusing the mercy of retreat. Across the room, laughter swelled around His Grace, the Duke of Ravensmere, as naturally as music. He stood at ease among men who wished to be him and women who wished to be chosen by him, his dark coat impeccable, his bearing effortless. Power clung to him with the intimacy of habit. He had been admired since boyhood and had learned, early and well, how to accept it without gratitude. When a matron, emboldened by champagne and ambition, inclined her head toward Eleanor and spoke a suggestive phrase, the Duke followed her gaze with polite curiosity. His eyes found Eleanor, and for a moment something unreadable passed through them. He studied her as one might a landscape glimpsed through rain, aware of its outlines but unmoved by its solitude. The matron waited, smiling too keenly. At last, the Duke replied, his voice low, measured, perfectly civil. He did not raise it, nor did he soften it. "She seems a respectable young woman," he said. Then, with a pause so slight it might have been accidental, he added, "But she would not be suitable as my wife." The words did not travel far, yet they arrived everywhere. They slid between shoulders, over goblets, along the spine of the room, until silence followed in their wake. Eleanor felt it before she heard it, the sudden stillness, the turning of attention. When the phrase reached her, carried by a sympathetic murmur, it did not wound her as sharply as it might have once. Instead, it settled, heavy and familiar, like a stone added to a burden long borne. She inclined her head, not in acknowledgment, but in farewell. Without haste, she gathered her shawl and moved toward the doors, her steps unhurried, her expression composed. If dignity could be learned, she had mastered it at great cost. The rain met her as she stepped into the night, cool and unrelenting, darkening the stones beneath her slippers. Each step carried memories she had learned to keep folded and hidden, a childhood of careful gratitude. Lessons in silence, the art of appearing grateful for scraps of courtesy. Tonight had reopened none of these wounds, it had merely confirmed them. What surprised her was not the judgment, but the ease with which it had been delivered. Eleanor paused beneath the chestnut tree, rain threading silver lines through her hair, and allowed herself one breath of honest feeling. She did not weep. Tears had always felt too public, too generous a gift to a world that had offered her none. Instead, she straightened, lifting her chin toward the darkened sky, and made a quiet vow that no man's assessment, however powerful, would be permitted to define her worth. Above, the Duke lingered longer than propriety required. He declined a dance, then another, offering smiles that felt suddenly rehearsed. His reflection in the tall windows appeared altered, as though the glass were holding him to account. He recalled the steadiness of Eleanor's departure, the absence of accusation in her bearing, and felt, inexplicably, the faintest sting of censure. When at last he left the balcony, a servant informed him that Miss Ashcombe had gone without escort. The knowledge settled uneasily. For the first time that evening, the Duke of Ravensmere wondered whether suitability had been a shield rather than truth, and whether, in sparing himself discomfort, he had committed a greater error. Somewhere beyond the gates, a woman walked into the rain with nothing but her dignity intact, and the thought followed him behind. Weeks passed, and London learned, as it always did, to replace one whisper with another. Yet the name of Eleanor Ashcombe lingered in corners where judgment preferred to linger, softened now by conjecture rather than cruelty. She withdrew from glittering rooms and into quieter duties, where her presence was neither questioned nor praised. At a small charitable school near the river, she read to children whose futures were already burdened, and there, at least, no one asked whether she was suitable for anything beyond kindness. It was there that the first disturbance found her. A plain parcel awaited her upon the narrow desk, wrapped in brown paper and sealed without crest. Inside lay a slim volume of poetry, rare and well kept, one she had once admired aloud at Hawthorne House when she believed herself unseen. Pressed between its pages rested a single winter flower, pale and precise, preserved with deliberate care. No name accompanied it. Eleanor closed the book at once, her fingers trembling despite her resolve, and returned the parcel that afternoon with a note of polite refusal. She wrote nothing accusatory, nothing warm. Gratitude, she had learned, could be mistaken for invitation. The Duke of Ravensmere received the returned parcel with an irritation that surprised him. Their paths began to cross with uncomfortable frequency. He saw her at church, seated among widows and governesses, her head bowed in unremarkable devotion. He saw her leaving the apothecary with parcels meant for others, her gloved hands reddened by cold. Each time, she acknowledged him with a slight inclination, nothing more, nothing less. By morning, conjecture had bloomed into scandal. Invitations cooled, faces turned with sharpened curiosity. Eleanor felt the familiar tightening of isolation, the knowledge that innocence offered no shield once suspicion took root. She endured it without complaint, though endurance demanded its price. At the school, benefactors questioned her influence. She began to understand that dignity, once challenged, required constant defense. They met by accident beneath the glass arcade of a winter conservatory, rain drumming above like impatient fingers. He offered protection, couched in courtesy, an unspoken arrangement that would restore her standing without entangling his heart. It was the language of his world, practical and bloodless. Eleanor listened without interruption, then refused him with a calm that bordered on mercy. "I would rather endure disfavor," she replied, "than accept shelter built upon silence." Something shifted then, subtle, yet irrevocable. The Duke saw, perhaps for the first time, the cost of his caution. He had mistaken composure for compliance, humility for hunger. As she turned to leave, rainlight framing her figure, he felt the loss before it occurred, sharp and undeniable. The conservatory seemed suddenly vast, emptied not by her absence, but by his own smallness. Eleanor walked home through streets glazed with lamplight, the echo of their exchange pacing her steps. Refusal had cost her more than she would admit, yet it left her strangely lighter, as though truth, once spoken, reclaimed a measure of power. She recognized the danger now, not of attachment, but of being reshaped by another's fear. Invitations arrived at his door bearing expectation rather than warmth. Decisions pressed upon him with an insistence he could no longer ignore, and beneath the weight of them stirred an unfamiliar resolve. Quiet, but growing, like thunder before sound. That night, he stood alone in his study, the returned book unopened beside him, and understood with unwelcome clarity that suitability had been a defense against fear. He had not spared her scandal. He had merely postponed his own reckoning. Somewhere beyond his windows, Eleanor Ashcombe slept without his protection, and the knowledge unsettled him more than any whisper ever had. For the first time, he suspected that choosing safety over truth might demand a payment he was no longer willing to postpone, and that the cost would soon be claimed. His movement drew attention like gravity. Conversations dissolved. Leno turned, surprised not by his approach, but by the absence of calculation in his expression. She saw faces that had dismissed her now, searching for permission to change. The Duke, watching her profile in the dim light, understood that courage had finally demanded something of him, and that he had answered too late to boast, but not too late to matter.